The first thing the Vor scout tasted was rust, and it laughed in the only way its kind could laugh, by flooding the channel with the color of contempt. On the bridge of the Bloom cruiser Pale Mother, the sensor thrall named Isk pressed 3 of its feeding limbs against the reading slate and felt the data climb up its nerves like warm water. The thing drifting at the edge of the Kesson drift was a freighter, an old one. Its hull was streaked with oxide, pitted by 40 years of micro-impacts, and its running lights blinked in the slow, tired rhythm of a vessel that had given up on being noticed. There were no weapon ports the scout could find. There were no shield emitters humming. There was only a wide, dull box of a ship with 6 cargo blisters welded along its spine, trailing a thin line of 9 smaller craft behind it like ducklings. A convoy. A weak, blind, primitive convoy, this far out, with no escort. Isk sang the readings to the command tier, and the command tier sang back its pleasure. The Pale Mother had been hunting for 11 days through the empty cold of the drift, looking for the human supply line that the deep listeners swore ran through this sector, and now here it was, fat and slow and asleep. "Range," said the voice of the brood captain, a low pulse through the wet walls. 2 light seconds and closing, Isk answered. "The lead vessel is registered nowhere in our archives. No origin code, no class marker. The hull is iron and old composite. I read no fusion signature large enough to fight." That last line pleased the brood captain most of all. The Vor did not measure ships by their guns. They measured ships by their heat, by the size of the reactors that fed those guns, and the cold, dull box at the center of the convoy ran a reactor barely warm enough to push it through space. A merchant heart, a herbivore heart. Isk had been a sensor thrall for 60 years, which was a long life for its kind, and in those 60 years, it had read 412 ships before they were opened. It had learned the look of prey, the way an old hunter learns the look of a wounded animal. Cargo haulers ran their reactors cold to save fuel. Warships ran them hot, always, even idling, because a warship that could not bring its guns up in 3 seconds was a warship that died. The dull box ran cold. Every instinct in Isk's ancient body said the box was a hauler, and every instinct had been right 412 times. But there was one reading Isk could not make sense of, and it had learned, in 60 years, never to ignore a reading it could not make sense of. The box's mass was wrong for its size. The scan said 900 meters of hull, common composite, hollow with cargo. But the gravimetric return said the box weighed 3 times what a hollow hauler should weigh. As though somewhere under that rusty skin, the ship was packed solid with something dense and heavy and still. Isk flagged the discrepancy and sent it up to the command tier, and the command tier sang back that gravimetrics were unreliable at this range, and the thrall should trust its eyes. So Isk trusted its eyes. That was the last order it ever truly obeyed without question. Isk turned its sensors to the 9 small craft trailing the box. They were old too, patched, their drives leaving the dirty trail of badly tuned engines, and they flew in the loose, nervous spread of frightened civilians who had hired a single freighter to shepherd them through bad space. One of them was venting atmosphere from a cracked seal. 2 of them were drifting out of formation, as if their pilots had fallen asleep. Everything about them said weakness, said panic, said prey, and Isk read all of it, and felt, again, that cold prickle along its limbs that it could not explain, because the readings were perfect, and that was the thing that troubled it. Isk had read 412 frightened ships, and frightened ships were never this perfectly frightened. Real panic was messy. This panic was tidy. This panic looked the way panic looked in a recording made to teach young hunters what panic looked like. But there was no entry in the archive for a ship that performed its own weakness, and a sensor thrall that contradicted the command tier twice in one hunt would not live to remain a sensor thrall much longer, so Isk swallowed the thought and said nothing. "Then we will not waste seed on it," the brood captain pulsed. "Take the small ones first, drink them, let the box watch." The Vor did not build metal warships, they grew them. The Pale Mother was a living thing, 2 kilometers long, a vast knotted body of chitin and muscle and spongy red tissue, and from the pores along her flanks, she now exhaled her children. 40 seed darts peeled away from the cruiser's hide, each one a barbed organic missile the length of a house, each one carrying a spore core that could land on a metal hull, bore through it, and fill the air inside with a choking pale dust, that turned lungs to paste in 90 seconds. The Vor had emptied 200 worlds this way. They did not see ships. They saw bodies that had not yet been opened. The Pale Mother had emptied her pores of every ready dart she carried, 40 in one breath, because the brood captain wanted the bloom finished before any other cruiser arrived to claim a share. It was greed. Plain greed, the oldest fault of the Vor, and Isk would later understand that the greed had been planned for, baited, drawn out of the cruiser, the way a fisher draws a fish onto a hook. The humans had wanted the Pale Mother to spend everything at once. A cruiser with no seed left in her pores was a cruiser with no teeth, and a Vor cruiser with no teeth had nothing left but the size of her body and the certainty of her instincts. Isk watched the darts streak toward the 9 small craft and felt the old satisfaction. The little ships scattered, of course. They always scattered. Prey always ran. But they did not run away from the box, they ran toward it. Curious, Isk murmured. The 9 small craft folded in tight against the dull freighter's flanks, sliding into the shadows between its cargo blisters, and the freighter's tired running lights went dark all at once. Not damaged, switched off. Isk felt the first faint thread of something it had no word for, a cold prickling along the feeding limbs, the body knowing before the mind that a reading had changed. The box has gone silent, it reported. The box is afraid, the brood captain answered. No, Isk said, and did not know why it said it. I do not think it is afraid. The seed darts crossed the last stretch of dark. The Vor command tier sang in anticipation of the bloom, the moment when the spores would take, and the human screaming would begin and stop. 40 darts, 40 open doors into 40 rooms of meat. The first dart reached the freighter's outer hull and detonated against it. And nothing happened. The barbed tip struck the oxide-streaked plating and shattered. The spore core, which had cracked open every airlock and viewport, and weak seam of 200 conquered ships, spread its pale dust across a surface that did not let it in. The dust drifted, found no crack, no seam, no soft place, and died in the cold. The second dart hit, and the third, and the fourth, and each one broke against the rusty box like rain against stone. Isk reread the surface scan. The rust was real, the pitting was real. But under the rust, where the scan had told it iron and old composite, there was something else, something layered, something dense, in a way the Vor archives had no entry for. A metal folded over itself again and again, until it was less a wall than a held breath. The gravimetric reading it had flagged an hour ago was not a discrepancy at all. It was the truth, and the visual scan had been the lie. The box weighed 3 times what a hauler should weigh, because the box was not hollow. The box was armor, all the way down, a wall pretending to be a wall. The Vor had 2,000 years of conquered worlds in their archives, 2,000 years of open ships, and not one entry, not a single one, described a hull that the bloom could not enter. The spore had always found a seam. There was always a seam. A ship was a box that kept air inside, and a box that kept air inside had doors, and doors had cracks, and cracks were all the bloom had ever needed. Isk searched the surface of the dull box for a crack, for a seam, for any soft place at all, and found none. The freighter had no visible airlock. It had no visible viewport. It had no cargo doors, no maintenance hatches, no sensor blisters, nothing the bloom could pry. It was, Isk realized with a slow, cold horror, not a box that kept air inside at all. It was a solid thing, shaped like a box, with the people sealed somewhere deep in the middle of it where the spore could never reach. Brood captain, Isk said carefully, the hull is not iron. Send more seed. The hull is not iron, Isk said again. And the cargo blisters are moving. The 6 welded boxes along the freighter's spine were not boxes. As Isk watched, the seams along their sides split, not torn open by spores but unfolding, deliberate, mechanical, hinging outward the way a beetle's shell hinges before flight. Beneath each blister was a recess, and in each recess, racked in rows that went down farther than the scan could follow, were guns. Not one gun, not 10. The scan counted, and stopped, and counted again, and reported a number that made the sensor thralls' 3 hearts stutter in their cages. The dull, rusty herbivore freighter had just opened 40 gun decks, and every one of them was turning toward the Pale Mother. Brood captain, Isk whispered into the wet dark of the bridge. "I think we have made a mistake." The freighter's running lights came back on, but they were not tired now, and they were not the soft amber of a merchant ship. They burned a hard, cold white, and they ran in a long, unbroken line down a hull that was suddenly far larger than the scan had ever said, because the box had been folded too, drawn in around itself, and now it was unfolding into the dark like a fist opening into a hand. Behind the rust was a name, etched 100 meters tall in plain block letters, and Isk's reader translated it without being asked, in the flat voice of a machine that did not understand what it was about to say. The name on the hull was Quiet Harvest. And the convoy it had been pretending to protect had never been a convoy at all. The 9 small craft tucked against its flanks were not refugees. They were gun tenders, and their crews were already aboard the big ship, already at their stations, already counting down. Isk had 11 seconds to understand all of this. The Vor had hunted humans for 2 years and had never once let a human ship fire first, because a Vor cruiser did not need to let anyone fire first. But the Pale Mother had spent her 40 seed darts on a wall that ate them, and she had no more children ready in her pores, and she was floating 2 light seconds from a thing that had just shown her 40 gun decks and a name like a tombstone. The brood captain stopped singing. It was, Isk thought in that frozen moment, the wrongest silence it had ever heard. The brood captain had sung through 200 conquests. It had sung over burning colonies and cracked stations, and the slow quiet of worlds going dark. It had never once gone silent in the middle of a hunt, because a Vor that stopped singing was a Vor that had stopped believing it would win, and the brood captain had never, in its long life, stopped believing that. Isk understood, hearing that silence, that whatever the dull box was, the brood captain had already counted the seconds and the seed and the distance, and arrived at the only answer the numbers allowed. There was no more seed. There was no range weapon. There was no time to grow more darts. And there was a thing 2 light seconds away that had eaten 40 of the Pale Mother's children without scorching its paint. In the silence, Isk heard, faintly, carried across 2 light seconds on a hailing frequency, the humans had no reason to think the Vor could read. A voice. A young voice. A human female. Calm, almost bored, reading words off a card the way a clerk reads a delivery manifest. "Pale Mother," the voice said. "This is gunnery aboard Quiet Harvest. You opened fire on a protected lane. You missed. We will not." Then the white lights along the human hull began, one by one, to flare. The young voice belonged to a gunner 3rd class named Mara Voss, and she was 19 years old, and her hands were not shaking, which surprised her more than anything else. She sat in the number 4 fire pit of the Quiet Harvest, a low steel saddle ringed by readout glass, with the muzzle controls of 10 heavy mass drivers under her fingers. 11 days ago, she had been the newest member of the gunnery section, mocked gently by the older hands for the way she checked her safety locks 4 times, for the way she still flinched at the recoil drills. 11 days ago, the chief gunner, a square gray woman named Ada Holt, had told her that the worst thing a gunner could feel in a real fight was nothing, because nothing meant your brain had quit on you, and a quit brain got the whole crew killed. Mara felt plenty. She felt the cold of the pit and the dry burn in her throat, and the slow, heavy thud of her own pulse. But her hands were steady, and that was enough. Lane breach confirmed. Ada Holt's voice came over the section channel, flat and unhurried. Target is the big organic. Don't waste rounds on the seed darts, they're spent. Voss, you've got the lower starboard arc. On my mark, walk your drivers across her belly, low and slow. We are not in a hurry. We are not in a hurry. That was the thing about the Quiet Harvest, that no one outside the ship ever understood, until it was far too late. The whole vessel was built around patience. She had spent 11 days drifting through the drift, dressed as a tired freighter, precisely so that something like the Pale Mother would come close, would commit, would empty its weapons against a hull it thought it understood. The rust was painted on over 40 centimeters of folded ablative laminate. The slow reactor signature was a second, smaller reactor, run hot for show, while the real plant, a caged star the size of a cathedral, idled in the keel waiting to be asked. The dull merchant box was a Vanguard-class strike dreadnought, 1,100 meters of warship, pretending to be 900 meters of cargo, and the 9 little ships had been her gun tenders all along, ferrying ammunition and crew, and never once carrying a gram of trade goods. The aliens called it a trick. The crew called it the lane. Mara had asked Ada Holt on the third dull day why they bothered. Why not just paint the ship as what it was, and let the enemy run? Ada had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Because running enemies come back. We are not out here to scare the Vor off this lane, kid. We are out here so the Vor stop using this lane. There is a difference, and the difference is whether anybody has to do this again next year." Now, in the pit, Mara understood the difference all the way down. "Mark," said Ada Holt. Mara opened her starboard arc. The quiet harvest did not roar. That was another thing nobody believed. A ship that size, firing that many drivers, made almost no sound at all inside, just a deep rolling shudder through the deck plates, a feeling more than a noise, like standing on a bridge while a freight train crossed below. 10 mass drivers in Mara's arc cycled and fired and cycled and fired, throwing slugs of dense alloy at a fraction of light speed, and across 2 light seconds of dark, the slugs found the Pale Mother's vast soft flank and went into her like nails into bread. On the Bloom cruiser's bridge, Isk felt the ship scream. The Vor did not have a word for what the Pale Mother did then, because no Pale Mother had ever done it. She was a living thing, and living things have nerves, and the human slugs tore those nerves apart in long ragged lines down her port flank. The wet walls of the bridge shuddered and wept. 3 of the feeding thralls came loose from their stations and were flung against the kitten. The brood captain's voice, which had not broken in 200 conquests, broke now into a high keening pulse that flooded every channel with the color of pain. Isk had heard prey make that sound. It had never, in 60 years, heard the Pale Mother make it. The cruiser was a predator. Predators did not make the prey sound. And yet here it was, pouring out of the brood captain across every channel, the sound of a thing discovering that it could be hurt. "Seal the wounds," the brood captain managed. "Grow new seed. Close with it. We must close. We cannot fight it at range. We have no range weapons left. Close. Close." Isk understood the logic, even through its own terror. The Vor fought by boarding, by spores, by smothering. Their cruisers carried no long guns because they had never needed them. For 200 worlds, the Bloom had been enough. The Pale Mother had to cross the gap and put her barbed boarding tendrils into the human hull and flood it with dust, and then the size of the human guns would not matter, because dead crews did not aim. But Isk had read that hull. There were no seams, there were no cracks. The tendrils would have nothing to grip and nowhere to bore. The censor thrall opened its mouth to say so, to tell the brood captain that closing was not a plan but a death, and then it closed its mouth again, because there was no other plan, and a thrall that took away the only plan its captain had left was a thrall that died first. So Isk said nothing for the second time, and the Pale Mother turned her wounded body toward the quiet harvest, and beat her great muscular engines, and lunged across the dark. "She is running at us," Mara said into the channel, and heard her own voice climb. "Chief, she is coming straight in." "I see her," Ada Holt said. "Good. Saves us chasing. Hold your arc, Voss. Keep walking your slugs along the same line. We are going to open her along one seam, like a tin. She is accelerating, closing fast. Then we will have less time to wait. Hold." Mara held. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than the recoil drills, harder than the 4 years of training, harder than telling her mother she was enlisting on the gun decks instead of the medical track. She held her arc steady on a thing the size of a city that was charging straight at her, and she walked her slugs along one long line down its belly, while it grew larger and larger in her targeting glass, and she did not flinch, because Ada Holt had told her that the worst thing a gunner could feel was nothing, and Mara was not feeling nothing. She was feeling everything, and using it. She thought, for one strange second, about the recoil drills she had hated. The chief had made her run them until her arms ached, made her sit in the cold pit and dry-fire empty drivers at a target light that jinked and dodged across the glass, made her hold the same line on the same target for an hour at a stretch, while the older hands laughed at the new girl, who could not even shoot at nothing without sweating. Mara had thought it was cruelty. She understood now it had been a gift. Her hands knew this. Her hands had done this 1,000 times in the cold dark with nothing at stake, and now that everything was at stake, her hands did not know the difference. They simply held the line. The Pale Mother covered the first light second in 90 seconds, faster than anything that big had a right to move. Her flanks streamed pale vapor from the wounds. Her boarding tendrils, each one 200 meters long and tipped with a spore barb the size of a gunship, uncoiled from her underbelly and reached forward through the dark, hungry. The first wave of tendrils reached the Quiet Harvest's hull while the cruiser was still half a light second out, flung ahead of the charging body like a fisherman's cast. 12 of them, whipping across the dark, barbs spread. On 200 worlds, the first cast had always landed. The barbs had always found a seam and bitten down and held while the cruiser hauled itself in hand over hand. Isk watched the cast go out and waited for the old satisfying jolt of contact through the deep song, the feeling of the prey hooked and held. It did not come. The 12 tendrils reached the human hull and found nothing to bite. They slid across 40 centimeters of seamless laminate, barbs scrabbling, finding no crack, no port, no soft place, and they could not hold, and they slipped off into the dark trailing wasted spore. Isk felt the cast fail through the deep song, felt the absence where the jolt of contact should have been, and the cold thing along its limbs spread all the way up into its 3 hearts. The cast did not hold, Isk reported. It did not know why it bothered. Brood Captain, the cast did not hold. There is nothing for the barbs to grip. Closer, the Brood Captain pulsed. We cast again from closer. The barbs will find a way in. The barbs always find a way in. But the barbs did not find a way in, because there was no way in, and the only thing closing the distance accomplished was to bring the Pale Mother into the killing reach of the human point defense. On the Dreadnought's command deck, the Quiet Harvest's master watched the Bloom cruiser come, and felt nothing like fear. His name was Captain Eli Brandt, and he had hunted the Vor for 2 years, and he had learned the single most important fact about them, which was that they had never, not once, fought an enemy who refused to be boarded. The whole logic of the Vor, 2,000 years of it, rested on the certainty that flesh could always be reached. Brandt had built his entire ambush around proving them wrong in front of an audience, because the Vor listened to each other across the deep dark, and what the Pale Mother learned in the next 4 minutes, every Bloom cruiser in the sector would learn by tomorrow. Brandt had been a young officer once on a colony picket when the Bloom came to a world called Halloway. He had watched it from orbit, unable to reach the surface in time, unable to do anything but record the readings and carry them home. He had watched 80,000 people go quiet over the course of one afternoon, while the Vor cruisers hung overhead and sang their song of pleasure. He did not talk about Halloway. He did not need to. Every choice he had made in the 2 years since had been a sentence in a single long answer to it, and the Quiet Harvest was the last word. Damage control, Brandt said. Report the outer hull. Outer laminate intact, Captain, came the answer from a deck 4 levels down, where a maintenance chief named Dolan stood at a board of green lights. She is scrabbling at us, but she cannot get a grip. We are taking spore residue across the dorsal arc, no penetration. The filters are holding it outside. Not 1 gram has come inboard. Keep it that way. It is what she is built for, sir, Dolan said, and there was a hard pride in it. She can sit in a cloud of that dust all day. She just cannot breathe it in, because she does not breathe. That was the secret under the secret. The Quiet Harvest did not cycle outside air. She carried her own atmosphere sealed in a closed loop behind 40 centimeters of laminate, scrubbed and recycled by machines that had never once opened a vent to the dark. The Vor Bloom killed by getting inside. There was no inside to get to. The crew of the Quiet Harvest lived their whole patrols inside a sealed shell, and they had volunteered for it, 1,100 of them, because every one of them had a Halloway of their own. Gunnery, Brandt said. She is going to keep trying to grapple. Let her get close. Let her think she has made it. Then I want the spinal driver charged, and I want every tender's point defense live. Aye, said Ada Holt. Voss, hold your belly line. Everyone else, kill those tendrils when they come into range. Do not let a single barb touch the hull a second time. The Pale Mother crossed the last half light second. Her tendrils swept forward, 10 of them, 20, a forest of grasping limbs reaching for the dull box that had hurt her. The Vor brood captain sang to its crew of the bloom that was coming. The human ship cracked open, the dust pouring in, the screaming, the silence, the way it had always been. Isk clung to its station and listened to its captain promise a victory it no longer believed in, and understood that the song was not for the crew at all. The song was for the brood captain itself. It was singing because the alternative to singing was silence, and the silence was the truth. And the truth was that the Pale Mother was a wounded thing throwing itself at a wall that ate seed and opened into guns. And then the human ship's point defense opened up, and the forest of tendrils came apart. It was not a fight. Mara understood that even in the middle of it, a fight was two things hurting each other. This was something else. The Quiet Harvest's gun tenders, the 9 little ships everyone had taken for refugees, fanned out around the dreadnought's hull and filled the closing gap with a wall of fast rounds, and every grasping vor tendril that pushed into that wall was sawn off at the root before it could reach the laminate. 200 meters of organic muscle, severed and tumbling. Spore barbs the size of gunships, cracked open in empty space where their dust could touch nothing. The Pale Mother reached for the human ship with 20 arms and lost 20 arms, and still she came, because she did not know how to do anything else, because the bloom had always been enough. Isk watched the tendrils fall and felt the deep, old certainty of its species crack down the middle. The tendrils were not a weapon. The tendrils were the assumption underneath every vor weapon, the belief that flesh could always reach flesh, that closing the distance was the same as winning. The humans had built a ship that made the assumption false, and they had not even built it as a clever trick. They had simply built a hull with no seams and a wall of guns around it, the most obvious answer in the universe to a species that opened ships through their cracks, and the vor had never once seen it coming, because the vor had never once met an enemy who thought the way to survive the bloom was to have no cracks at all. The brood captain tried one last thing. It ordered the Pale Mother to vent her entire reserve of loose spore at once, not in darts, just a vast pale cloud blown out of every pore, hoping to wrap the human ship in so much dust that some of it must find a way in. The cloud bloomed across the dark, swallowed the Quiet Harvest whole, turned the targeting glass in Mara's pit a soft, choking white. "I have lost visual," Mara reported, and her voice did not climb this time, because Ada Holt had drilled this too. "Going to gravimetric. Chief, I still have her. She is solid in the middle of the cloud. I have her belly. I am still on my line." "Good girl," Ada Holt said. "The cloud is for our eyes, not our guns. Stay on her." The cloud touched the hull and found nothing. The filters held. Not 1 gram came inboard. The dreadnought sat in the heart of a killing cloud that had emptied 200 worlds and breathed its own clean-sealed air and kept firing. And Isk, reading the human ship hold steady inside the cloud that should have been its grave, understood at last that there was nothing left in the vor arsenal that the Quiet Harvest had not already been built to defeat. "She is still closing," Mara reported. Her belly line was a long, glowing furrow down the cruiser's underside now, deep, structural, tracked by gravimetric through the blinding cloud. "Chief, even cut up she is going to hit us. She is too close, she has too much mass." "Let her," said Ada Holt, and for the first time, there was something almost gentle in the chief gunner's voice. "Captain?" "Spinal driver charged," Brant said. "Helm, hold us steady. Let her come right down our throat. Gunnery, you have the angle in 9 seconds." Mara switched her glass back to visual as the Pale Mother burst out of her own cloud at point-blank range, and the cruiser filled the targeting frame entirely now, a vast wounded mountain of red flesh and severed limbs, close enough that the system no longer needed to lead the shot at all. The cruiser's great mouth, the chitinous maw at her bow that had swallowed boarding parties whole on 200 worlds, gaped open as she lunged, and behind that maw, down the cruiser's long living throat, Mara could see the soft pale core where the Pale Mother kept the thing that made her think. 8 seconds, Ada Holt said. "Voss, hold your belly line to the last. You are the one keeping her from rolling away. The spine takes the kill, but you are the one holding the door." "Holding the door," Mara repeated, and held. On the Bloom cruiser, Isk read the human reactor signature climb, and climb and climb, the small warm merchant heart that had never been the real one, stepping aside at last for the caged star in the keel, and the sensor thrall finally found the word it had been reaching for since the seed darts died against the rust. The word was not fear. The Vor had a word for fear, and this was past it. The word was the one the Pale Mother's prey had felt on 200 worlds, in the last 90 seconds before the dust took them, when they understood that the thing closing on them was not going to stop, had never once stopped, and could not be reasoned with or escaped. The word was the human word. Isk did not know it, but the Pale Mother was about to learn it, in the last second before the spinal driver fired, and Isk, watching the human core flare white through the targeting glass, understood that the convoy it had laughed at had been the one laughing all along. The brood captain stopped singing for the second time. This time it did not start again. Isk felt the cruiser's living engines straining, every muscle in the 2-kilometer body pouring its strength into the last lunge, the maw gaping wider, the throat opening all the way down to the soft, pale core. The Pale Mother was a predator to the last. She did not slow. She did not turn. She drove herself straight down the throat of the thing that was about to kill her, because 2,000 years of instinct could imagine no other way to die, and the open maw that had been her greatest weapon became, in the final second, the clearest possible line to the one place a human gun could end her. Mara held the door. The seconds ran out, and the quiet harvest's keel began, very faintly, to hum. The spinal driver fired, and the Pale Mother stopped existing as one thing. The quiet harvest's keel held a single weapon that ran the entire 1,100-meter length of the ship, a magnetic accelerator the crew called the long note because of the way the whole hull hummed for half a second before it spoke. When it spoke now, it threw a tungsten lance the size of a frigate straight down the open maw of the charging cruiser, into the soft pale core at the end of that living throat, and out the other side. The lance did not explode. It did not need to. It simply passed through the Pale Mother from front to back, at a speed her flesh could not comprehend, and where it passed, the cruiser came apart along the seam Mara had spent 4 minutes carving down her belly. The two halves of the balloon cruiser drifted apart in the dark, venting vapor and severed nerve, and the slow pale snow of dying spores, and the quiet harvest slid past the wreck without slowing, the way a ship of the line passes a sinking enemy, close enough to count the wounds, never close enough to be touched. In the number 4 pit, Mara Voss let go of her controls and found that her hands were shaking now, after, the way they had not shaken during. She looked at the long dead furrow she had cut, at the place where the spine had finished what she had started, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the thing Ada Holt had warned her about, the dangerous nothing, creeping up the edges, and she pushed it back the way she had been taught, by speaking. "Target is dead," she said into the channel, and was glad her voice held. Number 4 ARC reports no remaining seed darts, no remaining tendrils. The cruiser is in 2 pieces. "Confirmed," said Ada Holt. "Good work, Voss. You held the door. It should have ended there. On 200 other days, against 200 other enemies, it would have. But the Vor did not hunt alone, and the Pale Mother had not been singing into an empty dark. Captain Brandt knew it before the sensors did. He had hunted the bloom long enough to understand the shape of it. The Vor moved in broods, and a brood captain that found rich prey did not keep it to itself. It called the others in to share the kill, because the bloom that fed together grew together. The Pale Mother had been singing for 11 days. Something had been listening. Long-range contact, called the sensor officer, a thin man named Cole who had been with Brandt for the whole 2 years. Multiple, bearing aft, coming out of the deep drift. Reading them now. "Captain, that is not a brood, that is a hive." The number came up on the command glass and Brandt read it without changing his face, because changing his face was a thing a captain did not do where the crew could see. 41 bloom cruisers, each one the size of the Pale Mother or larger, spread across 2 light minutes of dark and accelerating toward the quiet harvest in a loose, patient wall. The Pale Mother had been a scout. The hive behind her was the harvest she had been scouting for. 41 against 1. Brandt let the silence sit on the command deck for exactly 3 seconds, which was as long as he would allow it, and then he did the thing he had learned to do, which was to make the math small. "All sections, this is the captain," he said, and his voice went out to every pit and tender and deck on the ship, to Mara in the number 4 saddle, and Ada Holt at the gunnery board, and Cole at the sensors, and the 1,100 other souls who crewed the quiet harvest. "We have company. 41 bloom cruisers, inbound, 2 light minutes out. I know that number sounds like a lot. I want you to forget it. Here is the only number that matters. Each one of them has to come to us through a kill zone we built, one at a time, because the drift narrows here, and they cannot spread out. We did not come to this lane to fight a brood. We came to close the lane. The hive just volunteered to help us do it permanently. Gunnery, reload, tenders, rearm. We have 11 minutes before the first one is in range. Use them. In the number 4 pit, Mara Voss listened to her captain turn 41 into 1, and felt the dangerous nothing recede, and felt something harder take its place. She had enlisted on the gun decks against her mother's wishes because she had wanted, just once, to be on the side of the thing that stopped the bad thing from happening. She had spent 11 days in a rusty box, wondering if she had made a mistake. She was not wondering anymore. Reloading number 4, she said, and her hands were steady again. The 11 minutes did not feel like 11 minutes. They felt like one long-held breath. The tenders darted out and back, swapping spent magazines for full ones, topping the dreadnought's deep magazines from their own holds, and Mara watched her ammunition counters climb back to full and ran her hands over the muzzle controls the way Ada Holt had taught her, 4 times, checking the locks, because a quick brain got the whole crew killed, and a careless one did too. She used the minutes the way the chief had taught her to use the waiting. She did the small things. She checked her coolant lines and her feed motors, and the alignment of all 10 drivers. She drank half her water and saved the rest. She listened to the section channel, to the other gunners doing the same small things in their own pits, and the sound of all those steady voices, doing all those small careful jobs in the face of 41 oncoming cruisers was, she thought, the bravest sound she had ever heard. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was praying out loud. They were just checking their locks and topping their feeds and getting ready to hold the door again, because that was the job, and the job did not get bigger just because the enemy did. "Talk to me, Voss," Ada Holt said over the section channel, just to her now. "How are you doing in there?" "I am all right, Chief." "You held that belly line for 4 minutes without flinching. Most veterans flinch. You want to tell me how you did that?" Mara thought about it. "You told me the worst thing to feel was nothing," she said. "So, every time I started to feel nothing, I made myself feel the door instead, the thing I was holding. I just kept thinking about the door." There was a pause on the channel. "Keep thinking about the door," Ada Holt said. "We have got 41 of them coming through it now. Same job. You hold your arc, you hold your line, you keep them from rolling away from the spine. The captain and the long note do the rest. You good?" "I am good, Chief." "Then look alive. First one is almost in range." The hive came on. They came exactly as Brandt had said they would, funneled by the narrowing of the drift into a column no more than 3 cruisers wide, unable to flank, unable to surround, forced to feed themselves into the kill zone, 1 and 2 and 3 at a time. The Vor had never fought an enemy that wanted them to come close. The whole hive sang to itself of the bloom that was coming, the human box cracked open, the dust pouring in, and not one cruiser in the column understood that it was singing the same song the Pale Mother had sung, right up until the spine went through her throat. The first 3 reached weapons range, and the quiet harvest went to work. There was a rhythm to it that Mara fell into without deciding to. A cruiser entered the throat. The tenders stripped its tendrils as it came. Mara and the other belly gunners walked their lines down its underside, holding it square and keeping it from rolling away, and when it was held and lined, the keel began to hum, and the long note spoke, and the cruiser came apart, and then the wreck drifted out of the throat, and the next cruiser came in, and the rhythm began again. It was terrible work, and it was steady work, and the 2 things were not as different as Mara would once have thought. The chief had told her that too. On some dull day she could not now remember. The worst work, and the most ordinary work, feel the same from the inside, Ada Holt had said. That is why we drill, so that when the worst comes, your hands think it is ordinary. Mara stopped thinking after the 3rd cruiser. Not the dangerous nothing, the other kind. The kind Ada Holt had never had a name for, but that every good gunner found eventually, where the hands and the eyes and the breath all moved together, and the frightened thinking part of the brain stepped back and let the trained part fly. She walked her belly lines down one cruiser and then another, holding each one in place while the long note hummed and spoke and cut it in half, and the tenders sheared off the tendrils that reached for the hull, and the dark filled with the slow pale snow of dying blooms. 3 cruisers became 6. 6 became 11. The column kept feeding itself into the kill zone, because the hive mind could not conceive of a prey that would not eventually be overwhelmed by numbers, because the bloom had always been enough. The cruisers tried, as they came, the same things the Pale Mother had tried, because a hive mind has only one set of instincts, and every cruiser shares it. They cast their tendrils early, and the tenders cut them. They blew their clouds of loose spore, and the filters held. They drove themselves down the throat of the long-note maw first, because 2,000 years of instinct could imagine no other way to close, and the long note thanked them for the clear line, and took them through the core. Each cruiser made every mistake the one before it had made, because the hive could not learn fast enough to stop making them, because learning was a thing that happened slowly across the whole mind, and the whole mind was being cut to pieces 3 cruisers at a time. In the 7th minute of the slaughter, a cruiser broke the pattern. Instead of charging maw first, it rolled at the last second and tried to present its armored dorsal ridge to the long note, turning its soft core away, gambling that the human spine could not punch through 2 kilometers of chitin from the side. It was the first original thought the hive had managed all day, and Mara felt the change in her glass before the command deck called it. "She is rolling," Mara reported. "Number 4. Target is turning her core away. I am losing my belly line." "Then take it back," Ada Holt said. "You are the one who keeps them square. Do not let her roll." Mara walked her 10 drivers across the cruiser's turning flank. Fast. A long raking burst along the line of muscle that was doing the rolling, and the cruiser's roll faltered, as the nerves driving it came apart under the slugs. The core swung back toward the maw. The line opened up again. "She is square," Mara said. "Captain, she is square. Take her now." The keel hummed. The long note spoke. The clever cruiser came apart like all the others, and the hive lost along with it the one original thought it had managed to have, because the cruiser that had the thought did not survive to share what it had learned. 11 cruisers became 18. The dark at the mouth of the throat was a graveyard of drifting halves and pale snow, and the quiet harvest sat at the center of it, unmoved, unmarked, her sealed shell holding her own clean air, her tenders darting and stripping, her gunners holding their lines, her keel humming and speaking, while a thing that had emptied 200 worlds fed itself into her one cruiser at a time, and could not make her so much as turn aside. And in the 8th minute of the slaughter, the hive began, for the first time in 2,000 years, to do something the Vor had no instinct for. It began to hesitate. It was a small thing at first, the hesitation, so small that only Cole at the sensors caught it. The 19th cruiser reached the edge of weapons range, and slowed. Not by much. A flutter in its approach, a half-second pause where every cruiser before it had pressed straight on. Then it came in anyway, because the hive drove it in, and it died like the rest. But the 20th cruiser paused longer, and the 21st paused longer still, and for 3 full seconds it hung at the mouth of the throat, neither advancing nor retreating, its great living engines beating against each other, and Mara, watching it through her glass, understood that she was looking at something no human had ever seen. She was watching a Vor cruiser want to run. "Captain," Cole said quietly, "they are balking. The column is bunching up at the throat. The ones in front do not want to come in, and the ones behind are still pushing. They are fouling each other." "Hold fire on the balkers," Brant said. "Let them foul. Every second they spend arguing with each other is a second they are not coming at us. Gunnery, keep killing the ones that commit. Do not chase the ones that hang back." Mara understood the order even as it came. It was the same logic as the lane. You did not need to kill the frightened ones. You needed only to teach them to be frightened, and let the fear do the rest. So she held her fire on the balking cruiser and waited, and the cruiser hung at the mouth of the throat, and behind it the column ground to a slow, fouled halt. 21 living warships tangling with one another in the narrow dark, every one of them able to see, through the deep song they all shared, exactly what was waiting for them inside. That was the cruelty of the hive mind, Mara thought, though cruelty was the wrong word for a thing that did it to itself. A human fleet that lost half its ships still had captains who could decide, each in his own mind, whether the next ship would go in. The Vor had no such mercy. Every cruiser felt every death as its own. Every cruiser in that fouled column had now died 18 times over in the deep song. had felt 18 times the spine come through the core, and there was no individual mind among them that could shrug it off and press on regardless, because there were no individual minds. There was one mind, and the one mind had just been killed 18 times, and it could not stop feeling it. "They are breaking formation," Cole reported. "3 of the rear cruisers are turning. No, 4. They are trying to back out of the throat, and the ones behind them are in the way." "Steady," Brant said. "Nobody chase. Let them tie themselves in a knot. Gunnery. The 2 at the front are still committed. Take them, and then we wait." The 2 committed cruisers came in, and Mara held her belly lines on them one after the other, and the long note hummed and spoke twice more, and then there was a strange, terrible quiet at the mouth of the throat. The remaining cruisers had stopped coming. They hung in the dark, 20 of them now, a fouled and frightened mass, and not one of them would put itself into the kill zone, and the quiet harvest sat at the center of the throat, with her guns warm, and her shell sealed, and her crew breathing their own clean air, and waited, because she had all the time in the universe, and the hive had just discovered that it did not. The frozen column held for 90 seconds, and 90 seconds was a long time for a thing that could not decide. Twice in that time a single cruiser, driven by some pocket of the hive that had not yet caught the fear, peeled out of the fouled mass and threw itself at the throat alone, and twice the quiet harvest took it without effort. Mara held her belly line on the first one while it came, square and steady, and the long note spoke, and the cruiser folded, and the wreck drifted back into the frozen column and bumped against the cruisers that had not moved, and Mara watched, through her glass, the way the others flinched away from their own dead brother's body. The second lone charger did not even reach weapons range. Halfway down the throat it lost its nerve, mid-charge, the hive snatching it back, and it slewed sideways and fled, and the sight of it fleeing did more to break the column than any kill had. A cruiser that committed and died was a cruiser that had at least believed. A cruiser that committed and then turned and ran was the fear made visible, and the whole column saw it, and the whole column felt it, because the whole column was one mind. "They are eating themselves," Cole said softly, watching the fouled mass grind against itself in the narrow dark. "Captain, they are not even fighting us anymore. They are fighting each other. The ones at the front want out, and the ones at the back are still pushing in, and they are tearing their own tendrils, trying to turn around, in a space too small to turn around in. That is what a mind looks like when half of it wants to run, and the other half cannot let it," Brant said. "We have all felt it. The difference is, we get to have it one person at a time. They have to have it all at once. 20 cruisers in a tube, every one of them feeling every other one's panic on top of its own." He watched the mass for a moment longer. "Hold fire. Let them feel it. The longer they feel it, the better the lesson takes." In the number 4 pit, Mara held her fire, and watched the thing the captain had made happen, and understood, in a way the debriefs would never quite capture, that this was the real weapon. Not the long note, not the 40 gun decks, not even the seamless hull. The real weapon was patience, pointed at a creature that had never in 2,000 years needed any of its own, and what patience did to such a creature was worse than any slug. It gave the creature time to think, and a thing that has never had to think, given time to think while it is dying, thinks itself apart. Ada Holt's voice came over the section channel, low, meant only for her gunners. "Steady, all stations. Fingers off your triggers. The captain wants them stewing. This is the part of the job nobody trains you for, the part where you sit and watch and do nothing while the enemy beats itself. It is harder than shooting. Just hold. Just watch. Let it work." So Mara sat in her cold pit with her fingers off the trigger, and watched 20 bloom cruisers tear at each other in a narrow dark tube. And she did nothing. And the nothing was the hardest and most important thing she did all day. Harder even than holding the door. Because holding the door had a thing to push against, and this had nothing. Only the discipline to wait, while the enemy did to itself what no weapon could have done to it. She held that too. She was discovering, very good at holding things. Isk should have been dead. The sensor thrall had clung to a shard of the Pale Mother's broken bridge as the cruiser split, and the shard had spun out into the dark with a pocket of living tissue still sealed and warm around it, and so Isk drifted at the edge of the kill zone, alive, watching the hive it had called die one cruiser at a time. It could feel the others through the deep song. That was the curse of being Vor. No bloom cruiser died alone, because every cruiser was part of the one great hive mind that bound them all. And so Isk felt each death as the hive felt it, a sudden silence where a brother had been, and then another, faster than the hive had ever lost anything. 11 cruisers gone, 14, 18, and through it all the human ship simply sat at the narrow throat of the drift, and waited, and cut, and waited, and cut, and did not move, and did not tire, and did not run out of the slugs that should have run out long ago. Isk had been a censor thrall for 60 years, and in 60 years it had never once questioned the deep song, because the deep song was the self, and you did not question the self. But drifting now in its warm shard, cut off from the cruisers by distance but not by the song, feeling each death roll through the shared mind, Isk found itself thinking a thought that no Vor was supposed to be able to think. A thought that belonged to an individual and not to the hive. The thought was this: we should stop. We should turn around. We should never have come. The thought horrified Isk more than the dying did. It was a human-shaped thought. It was the kind of thought a thing had when it was alone in its own head, and the Vor were never alone in their own heads, and Isk understood that the human ship had done something to its species worse than killing 18 cruisers. It had made the hive feel, for the first time, the loneliness of a mind that wants to run and cannot make the rest of itself agree. The hive had a single mind, and that mind was beginning to understand something that no individual cruiser could have understood, because no individual cruiser survived long enough to learn it. The human ship was not trying to escape. It had never been trying to escape. It had come here to do exactly this. For 2,000 years, the Vor had won every war by being the thing that would not stop. Prey ran, the Vor followed. Prey hid, the Vor found. Prey fought, the Vor absorbed the losses and came again. Because there was always more bloom, always more seed, always more cruisers grown in the warm dark to replace the ones that fell. The Vor did not fear numbers, because the Vor were numbers. It was the one thing they were sure of, the floor under everything, the certainty that in the end there would always be more of them than there were of anyone else. And now, at the throat of the Kesson drift, the hive mind did the arithmetic it had never once in 2,000 years needed to do. And the arithmetic came out wrong. The human ship was killing them faster than the hive could feed cruisers into the kill zone. That was impossible. And it was happening. 20 cruisers gone, and the human ship's reactor signature had not dropped, and its rate of fire had not slowed, and its hull, which the pale mother had reached with 20 tendrils and a whole cloud of spore, did not show a single wound. The hive had thrown everything it had at a wall that ate everything it had, and for the first time in the history of the species, the one great mind of the Vor felt the floor go out from under it. It hesitated, and the hesitation became a halt. And the halt became a thing the Vor had no word for, the thing Isk had felt in its shard, the lonely human thought spreading now through the whole tangled mass of the fouled column. We should stop. We should turn around. We should never have come. On the command deck of the Quiet Harvest, Cole watched the column sit frozen at the mouth of the throat, and dared, finally, to say what he was seeing. Captain, they are not coming. 20 cruisers, and they are just sitting there. They cannot make themselves come in, and they cannot make themselves leave. They are stuck. Brant watched the wall of red flesh in the dark hang motionless, and felt the thing he had been hunting for 2 years arrive at last. Not the killing, the hesitation. The Vor had never hesitated in front of him before, and he understood exactly what it meant. They are learning, he said quietly. Get me the broadband, the one they use to sing to each other. Cole, you have been mapping their channel for 2 years. Patch me in. Cole's hands moved fast. You cannot talk to a hive mind, Captain. There is no captain to talk to. It is all of them at once. That is exactly why I want it, Brant said. I do not want to talk to one of them. I want to talk to all of them. The patch came up, and Captain Eli Brant, master of the Quiet Harvest, leaned toward the pickup and spoke to the entire Vor species at once, on the frequency they used to share the bloom, in the calm, flat voice of a man reading a manifest. This is the human warship Quiet Harvest, he said. You came to harvest this lane. You found us instead. We are not the only one of us. There are more ships like this one. There are many more. You have spent 2,000 years believing that you would always be the last one standing, because there were always more of you than of anyone else. I am telling you, on this channel, in front of every one of you, that this is no longer true. You can keep feeding cruisers into this throat, and we will keep cutting them in half, one at a time, until there is no more hive. Or you can leave this lane, and every lane like it, and never come back. Those are the only two choices left to you. Choose now. The hive heard him, all of it, at once. Isk, drifting in its warm shard, heard the human captain's voice go out across the deep song, and felt the entire mind of its species recoil from it, because the human had said the one thing the Vor had never let themselves think. There were more of them. There were many more, and they would not stop, because they had not come to win a battle. They had come to close a lane, and a thing that comes to close a lane is not a thing you can outlast. For 19 seconds, the deep song was silent. Isk had never heard the hive silent. The silence was worse than any scream. In the silence, Isk understood that the whole species was, for the first and only time in its history, doing what an individual does when it is afraid. It was thinking, it was weighing, it was discovering. All 20 cruisers, and every distant brood, and every warm dark nursery at once, that it had a choice, and that having a choice was the most terrible thing that had ever happened to it. Then the column broke. It did not retreat in order. Hive minds do not retreat in order, because order is a thing individuals do, and the Vor had spent 2,000 years learning to be one thing instead of many. The single great mind that bound the cruisers simply lost its nerve all at once, and 20 bloom cruisers turned away from the throat of the drift in the same instant, like a flock of birds turning, and fled back into the deep dark from which they had come, venting vapor, trailing severed tendrils, running from a single rusty box that had never once moved from the spot where it had chosen to stand. The Vor ran. For the first time in 2,000 years, the Vor ran. On the command deck, Cole let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for the whole engagement. They are breaking off. All of them. Captain, they are running. Let them, Brant said. Do not chase. We do not need to. They will carry the song home, and the song will do the rest. He straightened from the pickup. Stand down the spine. Gunnery. Cease fire. Tenders. Recover and report casualties. In the number 4 pit, Mara Voss heard the ceasefire order and took her hands off the muzzle controls and discovered that she had been crying, quietly, for some time, without noticing, not from fear. She did not know what from. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and checked her safety locks 4 times, because that was the thing she did. And then she sat in the cold pit and listened to the section channel fill with the voices of the other gunners, reporting their arcs clear, one after another, all alive. Number 4 arc clear, she said when it was her turn. No casualties this station. Copy number 4, said Ada Holt. And then, just to her, Voss. Yes, Chief. You held the door for 20 cruisers. 20. There are veterans on this ship, with 10 years in, who have never held a door that long. Mara did not know what to say to that. I just kept thinking about it, she said. The door, like you told me. I know, said Ada Holt. That is why I am telling you. The rest of them out there, the ones running home, they spent 2,000 years thinking nobody could hold a door against them. You are the reason they are going to spend the next 2,000 years wrong about that. You, and the spine. Mostly you. A pause. Get some water in you. You did good, kid. You did real good. Mara drank her water in the cold pit, and through the readout glass she watched the last of the bloom cruisers dwindle into the deep drift, and out past them, far out at the edge of the kill zone, she saw a small warm fleck of light that the sensors flagged as organic debris, drifting, alive. A single Vor survivor in a shard of broken ship, watching the human warship the way the human warship had wanted to be watched all along. She did not know it was Isk. She did not know the Vor had a sensor thrall, or that it had laughed at the rust 11 minutes ago, or that it was the only mind in the hive that would carry, firsthand, the memory of how the laughter had ended. She only saw the warm fleck, and she let it drift, because the captain had not ordered it killed, and because a thing that had watched did not need to die, it needed to remember. And Isk, in its shard, remembered everything. It remembered the rust that ate the seed. It remembered the 40 gun decks opening like a fist. It remembered the young human voice reading off its card, calm, almost bored. "You missed, we will not." It remembered the spine going through the pale mother's throat, and the column breaking, and the human captain's voice telling the entire species, on its own channel, that the floor under everything had just been taken away. The shard's warmth was fading. Isk did not mind. It had one job left, the same job it had always had, the only thing a sensor thrall was for. It sang the reading home. It poured everything it had seen into the deep song, and pushed it out into the dark toward the fleeing hive, so that every cruiser, every brood, every warm dark nursery where new bloom was grown, would know what Isk knew. The reading it sang was 4 words long, in the flat translated voice of a machine that had finally understood what it was saying. The harvest harvests back. The quiet harvest did not move for a long time after the hive ran. There was no order to stay. Brant simply did not give the order to leave, and the crew understood, the way a long-serving crew understands its captain, that the ship was holding the throat on purpose, sitting square in the middle of the kill zone where every fleeing cruiser could still see her on its sensors as it ran, so that the last image the hive carried away into the dark would be the rusty box exactly where it had always been, unmoved, unmarked, waiting. A ship that chases looks hungry. A ship that simply stays looks like it owns the place. Brant wanted the Vor to remember the staying. Below decks, the maintenance crews walked the hull in their sealed suits and found, to no one's surprise, that there was almost nothing to fix. The laminate had taken a film of dead spore across the dorsal arc and 1,000 small scrapes from the failed tendril casts, and that was all. Dolan, the maintenance chief, ran his gloved hand along a stretch of plating that 20 boarding barbs had scrabbled at, and found that he could not even feel where they had been. He laughed, once. A short, surprised sound inside his helmet, and then he went back to work, because the ship was due for her scheduled checks whether or not she had just broken a 2,000-year-old species, and the checks did not care what kind of day it had been. In the gunnery section, the older hands came one by one to the number 4 pit, not making a thing of it, just stopping by on their way to somewhere else, and each of them said some small, ordinary sentence to Mara Voss that she understood was not small or ordinary at all. "Good shooting. Nice line work on that roller. You held square the whole time, kid." They were the same hands that had laughed at her for checking her locks 4 times, and not one of them mentioned the locks now, and Mara understood that the laughing was over for good, not because she had asked for it to be over, but because she had earned the thing the laughing had been standing in the way of. Ada Holt came last. She did not say good shooting. She sat down on the lip of the number 4 pit, her square gray bulk filling the gap, and she looked at the dead furrows on the targeting glass for a while, the long glowing lines Mara had cut down 20 cruisers, and then she said, "You know what the hardest part of this job is, Voss? It is not the fighting, it is what comes after the fighting, when there is nothing to hold and the nothing tries to get into you. That is the part that takes the veterans down, not the cruisers, the quiet after." She nodded at Mara's hands, which were steady on her knees. "You are already doing it right. You are sitting here breathing, and you have not let the quiet in. Keep doing that. The day you cannot keep doing that is the day you tell me, and we get you off the guns for a while. There is no shame in it. There is only the quiet, and whether you can keep holding the door against it. Same job as always." "Same job," Mara said. "Same job," Ada Holt agreed, and got up, and went to find the next gunner who needed the same thing said. Mara sat in her cold pit for another hour, breathing her own clean-sealed air, watching the last warm fleck of the Vor survivor drift at the edge of her glass until it went dark and cold, and the sensors stopped flagging it as alive. She did not feel triumph, even then. She felt the door, the way Ada Holt had taught her, the line between the way things had been and the way they would be now, and she held it, and she did not let the quiet in, and that, she was beginning to understand, was the whole of the work, and she was good at it. When the quiet harvest finally left the throat of the drift, 3 days after the hive had run, she did not leave the way a victor leaves a battlefield. There was no formation, no salute fired into the dark, no message broadcast to the inner systems claiming the kill. Brant did none of that. He simply gave the order to repaint, and the maintenance crews went back out across the hull in their sealed suits and laid down a fresh coat of oxide over the laminate, streaking it, pitting it, dulling the hard white running lights back to a tired amber, turning the warship that had just broken a species back into a tired old box that nobody would look at twice. Mara watched them work from an observation blister, and she asked the crewman beside her, an older hand who had been aboard longer than she had been alive, why they were hiding the ship again after it had just won. Would it not be better, she said, for the Vor to see exactly what had beaten them, to know the shape of the thing that had cut their cruisers in half? The old hand shook his head. You have got it backwards, kid, he said. We do not want them to know the shape of us. We want them to be afraid of every shape. If they knew a quiet harvest by sight, they would just learn to run from quiet harvests and keep eating everything else. But they do not know our shape. They only know that some tired box, somewhere, ate their seed and opened into guns. So now every tired box is the one. Every freighter. Every convoy. Every patched-up flock of refugees with no escort. We did not teach them to fear us. We taught them to fear everyone who looks weak. That is a much bigger fear. And it does much more work, and it costs us nothing but a coat of paint. Mara turned that over for a long while, as she watched the rust go back on, layer by layer, until the deadliest ship in the dark looked once more like the saddest one. She thought she understood, then, the whole shape of what they did out here, and why the chief had told her, on the first dull day, that running enemies came back. You did not chase the enemy, you did not even show the enemy your face. You wore the disguise of the weak, and you sat patient in the narrow places, and you let the powerful come to you full of contempt, and then, just once, where everyone could feel it, you taught them that contempt was the most expensive feeling in the universe. After that, the disguise did all the work. After that, the rust was the weapon, and the patience was the weapon, and the fear in the song was the weapon, and the guns hardly needed to speak at all. For 3 days, the quiet harvest sat in the throat of the drift, and for 3 days, the deep listeners aboard her tracked the song of the fleeing hive as it spread outward through the dark, and what they heard told them, more clearly than any battle report, that something had broken in the Vor that would not mend. The song changed. Cole had spent 2 years mapping it, learning its colors, the warm, certain pulse of a species that grew without limit. Now the pulse stuttered. There were silences in it that had never been there before, the silences of a mind second-guessing itself. And woven through the silences was a single repeated reading, passed from cruiser to brood to nursery and back. The 4 words a dying censor thrall had sung into the cold. The harvest harvests back. The Vor could not stop repeating it. It was the first doubt the species had ever held, and a hive mind cannot hold a doubt the way an individual can, quietly, in one corner of itself. A hive mind holds every thought in all of itself at once, and so the doubt was everywhere. In every cruiser, in every half-grown thing hanging in its birthing sac, an entire species lying awake at once. The strategists back in the inner systems had argued for years about how to fight the Vor. Some had wanted bigger fleets, enough cruisers to meet the bloom head-on, and grind it down by mass. The numbers had never worked. The Vor made more of themselves faster than any shipyard could match, and a war of mass against a thing that grew without limit was a war you lost slowly. Brandt had argued the other way. You did not beat a thing that grew without limit by being bigger. You beat it by teaching it that there was an edge, somewhere out in the dark, that it could not grow past, and then by making sure it could never tell where the edge was. One rusty box at one narrow throat had just taught the entire Vor species that the edge existed. The rest of the war would be teaching them that the edge was everywhere. The fleet understood this now, because the quiet harvest had proven it, where the whole hive could watch. Within the year, there were a dozen rusty boxes drifting the contested lanes, then 30, then 100, each one a Vanguard-class dreadnought wearing 40 years of painted oxide and trailing a flock of patched, panicking, tidally frightened civilian ships. The Vor could not tell them from real freighters. That was the genius of it. A real freighter and a quiet harvest looked identical right up until the gun decks opened, and by the time the gun decks opened, it was already 11 seconds too late. So the Vor learned to leave the freighters alone. All of them. The real ones and the false ones alike, because the cost of guessing wrong even once was a cruiser cut in half along its belly, with its core punched out the back. The bloom that had emptied 200 worlds began, lane by lane, to starve, not because the humans killed every cruiser, But because the humans had made every tired box in the dark, a question the Vor could no longer afford to answer. Deep in a nursery hollow 40 light-years from the Kesson Drift, in the warm, wet dark where the next generation hung half-formed, a broodmother that had never seen a human ship felt the song arrive, and, for the first time in the long history of her kind, did not grow her sacks to the edge of the hollow. She left a margin. She did not know why. The instinct that had driven her foremothers to fill every dark place they reached had a new thread in it now, a thread of caution, of leaving room, of not pushing all the way to the edge, because somewhere past every edge, there might be a rusty box that ate seed and opened into guns. It was a small thing, the margin she left. It was the first small thing, but the Vor were one mind, and what one nursery learned, all of them learned, and the margin spread through the species like the doubt had spread, and the bloom that had never once stopped growing began, very slowly, to pull itself in. The humans never knew about the broodmother and her margin. They only saw the lanes go quiet, the cruisers stop coming, the contested space go still. But that was the shape of the victory, down at the bottom of it, where no report could reach. A thing that had grown without limit for 2,000 years had learned, from one rusty box, and one 19-year-old gunner, and one dying thrall's forward song, to leave a margin, to be afraid of the edge, to wonder, every time it reached toward something small and tired and undefended in the dark, whether the small, tired thing was about to open into 40 gun decks and answer. The powerful had been made to feel small, and feeling small, for the first time in their long and terrible history, the Vor began at last to leave the rest of the dark alone. The song reached the deep nurseries of the Vor 11 hours later, and the warm dark, for the first time since the species had crawled out of its first dead world, learned what it felt like to be afraid of the cold. Isk did not live to know it. The shard's warmth gave out in the 9th hour, and the sensor thrall died drifting at the edge of a kill zone, with its last reading still echoing outward through the song. But the reading lived. That was the thing about a hive mind that the humans had understood, and the Vor never had. You could kill a cruiser. You could kill a brood. You could not kill a memory once the whole mind held it, and now the whole mind held the memory of the rusty box that opened 40 gun decks, and the young voice that said you missed, and the spine that went through the pale mother's throat, and the captain who told an entire species that the floor was gone. The deep nurseries were the heart of the Vor, the warm, wet hollows deep in old asteroids, where new bloom was grown, where the next generation of cruisers hung half-formed in their birthing sacks, fed on the harvest of 200 worlds. For 2,000 years, the nurseries had known only one feeling, the slow, warm certainty of a thing that grows without limit, that fills every dark place it reaches, that has never once met an edge it could not push past. The song that reached them now carried a different feeling, and the half-grown cruisers in their sacks felt it before they had minds to understand it, the way a child feels its mother go tense before it knows what fear is. The nurseries felt the edge. For the first time, the Vor felt the edge of themselves, and on the other side of the edge was a thing that ate seed, and opened into guns and would not stop, and would not tire, and was not the only one of its kind. The Vor stopped using the Kesson Drift. Then they stopped using the 3 lanes that fed into it. Within a year, they had pulled back from 40 light-years of contested space, abandoning nurseries they had held for centuries, because the deep song now carried a single certainty, that no bloom could overgrow. Somewhere out in the human dark, there were rusty boxes that ate seed and opened into guns, and there was no telling which tired freighter was one of them, until it was far too late to run. The humans called it the quiet harvest doctrine. You did not need to defend every lane. You needed only to make the enemy unable to tell a defended lane from an undefended one. A single dreadnought dressed as a freighter, sitting patient at a narrow throat, could close 1,000 lanes at once, because the fear did the work the guns could not. The fleet built more of them after that, more rusty boxes, more tired-looking convoys with no escort, more 9-ship flocks of patched and panicked civilians, who flew their performed panic just a little too tidily, and the Vor, who could not tell which was which, learned to leave all of them alone, which had been the entire point from the beginning. Mara Voss learned all of this later, in the debriefs, in the long, quiet weeks after, when the quiet harvest limped back toward the inner systems, trailing her 9 tenders, and carrying 1,100 living crew, and not one empty saddle. She learned that the survivor she had let drift had carried the whole story home. She learned that the hive had broken, that the lanes had closed, that the rust on the hull had been worth every careful hour the maintenance crews had spent painting it on over the laminate. She learned that the captain had never once intended to fight a brood, only to be found by one, in front of an audience, so the audience would carry the lesson. She also learned what the older hands had meant, on the first dull day, when they had mocked her gently for checking her safety locks 4 times. They had stopped mocking her after the drift. Ada Holt had seen to that. The chief gunner had stood up in the gunnery mess, the night after, with the whole section watching, and said that gunner 3rd Class Mara Voss had held a kill door open for 20 Bloom cruisers without flinching, and that anyone who still wanted to laugh at the way she checked her locks could come explain to the chief why 4 checks was too many for the gunner who had held the longest door in the ship's history. Nobody had wanted to explain that. The mockery had ended the way the Vor's mockery had ended, with a sudden quiet and a changed mind. But the thing Mara remembered, in the years after, on other ships, in other pits, when she had a section of her own, and young gunners of her own checking their locks too few times, was not the praise. It was a moment near the end, when the column had broken, and the Vor were running, and the section channel had gone quiet, and she had sat in the cold number 4 saddle, and watched the warm fleck of the survivor drift at the edge of the dark. She had thought, in that moment, about the door, the thing she had been taught to hold, and she had understood, all at once, and all the way down, that the door was never the hull, and it was never the lane, and it was never even the 1,100 souls aboard the Quiet Harvest, though it was all of those too. The door was the line between the way things had been for 2,000 years and the way they would be now. On one side of that door, the powerful took whatever they wanted, and the small ran or hid or died, and the bloom was always enough. On the other side of the door, a tired freighter could be the deadliest thing in the dark, and a 19-year-old in a cold saddle could hold a line that an entire ancient species could not break, and the powerful learned, for the first time, what it felt like to be the one who had to choose between leaving and dying. She had held that door. She had kept it open just long enough for an entire galaxy to walk through to the other side. She thought about Isk sometimes, though she never knew its name, and never learned that it had been the one to read the rust and feel the cold prickle along its limbs and swallow the warning it should have spoken twice over. She thought of the warm fleck she had let drift, and she did not regret letting it drift, because Ada Holt had taught her the difference between a thing you killed and a thing you let carry the lesson home, and the fleck had carried the lesson better than any weapon could have. A dead enemy taught the dead nothing, a living enemy that had watched, and remembered, and gone home to tell the rest, that was worth more than the deepest magazine. The captain had understood that. It was why he had not ordered the fleck killed. It was why he had broadcast on the hive's own channel, instead of simply finishing the column to the last cruiser. He had not come to win a battle. He had come to change a mind, and you could not change a mind that you had killed. Years later, when Mara Voss was a chief gunner herself, gray at the temples, square in the shoulders the way Ada Holt had been, she trained her own young gunners the way she had been trained. She made them check their locks 4 times. She made them learn the difference between the dangerous nothing and the working stillness. She made them run the recoil drills until their arms ached, made them hold the same line on the same dodging target light for an hour at a stretch. And when the new gunners complained that it was cruelty, she told them what she had learned, that the cruelty was a gift, that the worst work and the most ordinary work felt the same from the inside, and that the whole reason for the drilling was so that when the worst came, their hands would think it was ordinary and hold the line. And on the first dull day of every patrol, when the new gunners asked her why they bothered dressing a warship as a freighter, why they did not simply paint the ship as what it was and let the enemy run, she told them the same thing she had once been told, in the same flat voice. Because running enemies come back, she said. We are not out here to scare them off this lane. We are out here so they stop using it. There is a difference, and the difference is whether anybody has to do this again next year. And when the new gunners pressed her, the way she had once pressed Ada Holt, and asked how she had held a kill door against 40 Bloom cruisers when she was 19 and barely trained, she gave them the only answer that had ever been true. I just kept thinking about the door, she said, and I never let it close. The Vor never came back to the Kessin Drift. The rust on the Quiet Harvest's hull was repainted, year after year, by maintenance crews who understood exactly what it was for, and the ship went on sitting patient at narrow throats, looking tired, looking blind, looking like prey, for the rest of her long service life. She never lost a lane, she never lost a fight. She never once had to chase an enemy who had seen what she was, because the deep song of the Vor still carried, 2,000 years of certainty broken in 11 minutes, the four-word reading that a dying censor thrall had sung into the cold. The harvest, harvests back. Out past the inner systems, out in the human dark where the rusty boxes wait, it still does.